Hello, my name is Steve Coughlin. I am one of the people who run Unconstrained Analytics Inc. And today we're going to talk about the CVE. If you want detailed information on the evolution of the CVE, please get a copy of my book, Catastrophic Failure, Blindfolding America in the Face of Jihad. What I'd like to talk about is the CVE has countering violent extremism, has supplanted the counterterrorism the counterterrorism effort. And in terms of thinking about that, you may think, well, countering violent extremism is one avenue of approach on the counterterror front, but actually it's not. Actually, the CVE, countering violent extremism narrative, seeks to overwrite and supplant and displace actual bona fide counterterror efforts. Why do I say that? Because bona fide counterterror efforts depend on, one, knowing who the terrorists are as a matter of fact. So if they say they're Al Qaeda, or they say they're ISIS, or they say they're the Muslim Brotherhood, and they say their mission statement is to wage jihad to implement Sharia law, well, that is who they are, in fact. The violent extremism narrative starts with the idea that you can't name them at all because it has nothing to do with anything other than an abstract political science, sociological, psychological, anthropological meaning, which is reduced to models that then have narratives that are ruthlessly enforced. And what they all have in common is that you can say anything you want so long as you never talk about Islam at all. Now, I want to make it clear that there is actual hard Islamic law on this. It's the Islamic law of slander that basically says that a non-Muslim does not have the right to speak in any way that a Muslim would disapprove in areas concerning Islam. Now, if you read the book, I'll break that down into the line and verse so you could see that there's nothing exaggerated or overly hyperbolic about that statement. Now, why is this important? Because I think I first started picking up on this trend back in 2003 and started talking about some things, and I'm going to come back to that. And then in 2008, we came across the OIC's, in 2005, we came across the Organization Islamic Cooperation's newly released 10-year program of action. So who is the OIC? The OIC is the second largest intergovernmental organization, second only to the United Nations. When they meet at the top level, it's the heads of states. So when all the heads of states of all 57 member states, it's actually 56 member states and the Palestinian Authority, and they all unanimously agree on a rule, it actually does, one, represent the Ummah, Islamic community at the leadership level, and two, it can effectively have the force of law. Now, I don't want to go too far into this discussion, but what's important is in 2005, they had something called the 10-year program of action to make defamation of Islam a crime in every jurisdiction, including the United States, Canada, the whole Western world. Now, one of the goals they had was to implement this through international organizations like the United Nations or the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. We're not going to deal with that. However, I just want to tag it so you can associate it. We see that working its way through two lines of operation. One is UN Resolution 1618 that uses the international language of, it's all facially neutral language to implement it, and a supporting effort in the international community that seeks to redefine the term incitement in international treaties, so that in redefining the term incitement in international treaties, you can redefine its application once adopted by a member state, like the United States or Canada, when someone says that. It's a covert attack on free speech. This is all a covert attack on free speech. Finally, there's the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism narrative, and this has worked its way through, well, in the United States, primarily through influence campaigns by the United Nations, but we also see it picking up in international organizations as well. So as I look at this, having established in this discussion a nexus to Islamic law, this CVE, Countering Violent Extremism narrative, please take note of the fact of all the leaders who are coming out and saying, after a terrorist attack, where the person is saying Allahu Akbar, cries out that they did this in the name of Islam, that our political leaders are coming out and saying this has nothing to do with Islam, despite the fact that the actors plainly said that it did. Well, I want you to understand this is an example of a narrative overwriting the facts. It is a narrative that declares that we are going to follow this, what our narrative demands, and that it have nothing to do with Islam, even as the actor himself, even as the evidentiary record says it most clearly does. Why is this important? Because once you decide that it has nothing to do with what the declared agent said it has everything to do with, your narrative is about enforcing esoteric ideas, theoretical models at the expense of the reality on the ground. Now, this is bad enough, except they want to make this a legal standard so that not only can they fire counterterror analysts for bringing up the fact that, hey, I'm sorry, but Major Hassan did say he fought jihad, and this is why he was killing. Okay, think about that. That would be firing somebody for stating facts which cannot be controverted, which actually explain the motivating factor where there's actually doctrine behind it. I'd like you to think about that. Because once we establish that the CVE is overriding that counterterror effort by redefining things in abstract terms, we lose the ability to actually define the terrorist threat. And we also give the terrorist threat the ability to range freely in America. Now, sure, our national law enforcement agencies can go and find the final mile when an ISIS entity or an Al-Qaeda entity is going to do something where they're about to act and they have the evidence of the actual event. But we're depending on that final wire, that final mile. So when did I first start seeing this? Well, when I first started doing some research when I was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff in uniform, before I demobilized, I went and I bought a book called Peace and the Limits of War, Transcending the Classical Conception of Jihad. It was written by a man named Louis Safi. And I have long since recognized how interesting it was that this book was published in 2001, the same year as 9/11. It's one of my goals to go and look for the actual release date, and did this actually happen before 9/11? Because that just makes me think how convenient the timing of it is. And what did he say in his book? I'm going to read it. Advocates of jihad as holy war constitute today a tiny minority of intellectuals in both Muslim societies and the West. Western scholars who accept jihad as holy war feed on the position of radical Muslim ideologues. Well, I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what the goal of intelligence is. And let's just start with Sun Tzu's first rule of war, know the enemy. Well, if my job is to know the enemy, and the enemy are people who accept jihad as holy war, wouldn't I want to know that? Wouldn't that be my job? Because how many times have you heard political leaders and military leaders and national security leaders say, if we say that it has to do with Islam, we're validating their narrative and we're implicating a religion.
No, we hear that every single time there's an Islamic terror attack.
Exactly. That's bad enough that media people will say that. But what's really the problem is when intelligence people work in the intelligence community, the threat identification community say that. Because what they're saying is, we're doing something wrong. Let me give you that sentence again, direct quote. Western scholars who accept jihad as holy war feed on the position of radical Muslim ideologues. Well, I must tell you, if we're fighting radical Muslim ideologues, then that is exactly the concept we have to know to be able to know them and to counter them. So remember, this was written in 2001. Now, who was this guy who wrote this Peace and the Limits of War? It was a man named Louis Safi. And he was a member of, and still is a member of, the Muslim Brotherhood. He was an executive director of the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. He was a member of ISNA, the Islamic Society in North America.
Wait, wasn't the IIIT the organization that came up with the concept of Islamophobia?
Indeed, they did in the mid-'80s, late 80s. And what I'm getting at here is the definition it has all of our national security people say, hey, listen, if you say bin Laden is doing this because of Islam, you're validating their theory, and you're really stressing a religion that has nothing to do with this. Well, let's stipulate this. Let's just stipulate that we're not going to make any grand statements about the true nature of Islam, but we are going to say the people we're fighting say this is Islam when they decide to attack us. and they do attack us, and they do kill us. I would have to say that it's one of two major axes of approach. One is UN Resolution 1618 and remember, 1618 is stated in facially neutral language. It doesn't have the language of Islam in it. And that's one axis, and the other is CVE. And if you go back to the OIC's 2005 10-year program of action, you will see that from there you see both of these axes approach. So I would say there's one objective, and that objective is to make defamation of Islam a crime in every jurisdiction. One avenue of approach is UN Resolution 1618 and those related things, and the other is the CVE. One attacks primarily internationally, one attacks primarily domestically, although what you're seeing now is they're now hooking up and you're seeing a little bit of both. So I would say that that's what's happening, and you see that it's penetrated very heavily into national security communities. You see it's also penetrated very heavily into international media. Of course, you have to remember that international media that wants to do business in places in the Middle East can lose their, might put their business plan at risk by not trying to enforce this law in the West to maintain access in the Middle East.
So I noticed a few things, especially since the new year. Recently, within the last week or so, there's been arrests, convictions, and fines, and even some jailing of people for saying things that are demonstrably true about Islam, but that make it appear in a negative light. So it was a Facebook post in Denmark. There was a man who wrote a post on Facebook comparing Islam to Nazism, for which he was fined, and they specifically targeted the fine to be just below the mark where you could appeal it. So they want to establish a precedent in law that can't be allowed. In Scotland today, there was another fellow who made, I believe, a social media post about Islam who was arrested subsequently. And these, of course, it's central dogma to democracy to be able to criticize an ideology, especially a religious one would think. And I've also noticed that there's a significant change in policy on both Facebook and Twitter, so that any criticism of the ideology, the doctrine of Islam, that will result in the cancellation of your account. And they've even gone into the police have even gone door knocking in the Netherlands to ask people why they wrote certain things. Is this a consequence of the CVE and the 1618, and if so, how?
Well, it's absolutely a consequence of it. When I was attending over the last couple of years the OSCE meetings in Warsaw, Poland, OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, you could see how the OSCE was working with, they would call their friends in the social media world to get a hold of speech. Now, in U.S. constitutional law, that would mean that these entities are operating under color of authority. Now, that doesn't have such a precedent under international tribunals. But when you saw that these international groups with the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, were actually working with these social media groups, that means they're basically putting the fix in. You're not supposed to see this. Now, I want to make it clear, all this is going to manifest itself in the violent extremism narrative that is going to create a legal standard called hate speech that they'll first use to say, well, there's free speech we have to tolerate, even though it's terrible, and that's hate speech. But once they get that created, then they're going to start prosecuting it. And what you're going to find is the CVE is going to wicker the Islamophobia narrative so that it becomes a form of hate speech. You already see that. Now, I want to take one step back from what you're saying. I haven't seen all the stories you're talking about, so I don't want to comment on them specifically. But I will say this. When you make the point that people are making comments about things that can be demonstrated to be true and they're being prosecuted, you are looking at Western democratic governments prosecuting their own citizens for something that can be shown to be true. That is an attack on truth. It is a direct attack on truth, and as such, it is an attack on thought. And at some point, you have to say, this has to be resisted. You cannot consider yourself a free society and allow this attack on truth to happen. Anytime somebody goes on any format, whether it's Facebook or whether it's Twitter or whether it's on TV, and they can articulate something known to be true, and they can demonstrate to be true, and it gets censored, that is an attack on truth. And that is outrageous.